would Russia use its military force levels to attack Finland? This would create a bigger war in Europe. America has not really helped the cause of peace. Some would argue that the arms merchants in America and defense companies really want that conflict to go on and on, because the longer it lasts, the more money they make. The decision of Finland to opt for joining NATO, an organization which has traditionally been known to be anti the Soviet Union and now Russia, has caused considerable alarm in Moscow, and this decision of Finland has been closely followed by that of Sweden on the very same day, when both of them announced their decision to be NATO members. By announcing that you would be a NATO member doesn't automatically make you a NATO member. The process is still long, as we've seen in the case of Ukraine, which in the initial stages of the Soviet invasion of Ukraine was hopeful that Ukraine would become a NATO member and therefore be protected by NATO under Article 5 of its constitution, whereby any member of NATO country, if attacked by somebody else, in this case Russia, would get the full military protection of other NATO countries. But Ukraine wasn't given membership, and now the Ukrainian leader, Mr. Zelensky, has made it known that NATO membership really doesn't matter for a variety of reasons. One of them is that he's being propped up by America and some European countries, that with or without NATO, he will get the kind of military support that he needed to ward off the Soviet capture of his country. But let's go back a bit into NATO and what has prompted Finland and Sweden, who have traditionally maintained neutrality for decades, to now consider joining NATO. Clearly, there is fear in Finland, which has a 1,300-kilometer long border with Russia and a history of tensions with Russia and sometimes minor border skirmishes and conflicts, that there could be a Russian invasion into Finland next, because it wasn't yet a member of NATO. So what does meaning it have for Finland and Sweden when they become members of NATO? See, NATO as an organization started finding its roots in 1948. By 1948-49, it announced its formation in April 49, and amongst its charters was the one which is most famous, that is Article 5, which guarantees all NATO countries military protection. Some of them are very small, but some of them are very big and powerful, like the United States. So the NATO countries decided that one country from NATO, if attacked by anybody, would be seen as an attack on all NATO members. So since then, NATO has had a checkered history. One, that in the 50s and 60s, it became clearly a counter to the Soviet Union, then known as USSR. By 1961, the Berlin Wall came up, which was clearly the start of the Cold War divide, either side of the Iron Curtain. And then the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968 got NATO more and more militarized. But it was really the decades of the 70s, 80s and 90s that redefined NATO's role somewhat. Many people see NATO as a military organization set up to confront the Soviet Union, now Russia. But it has two other roles. One is to stop the rise of nationalistic militarism, some of which we saw in countries in the Balkans in 2 decades ago, when NATO got militarily involved with a UN sanction for NATO operations in Kosovo in particular, a 78-day military operation. But the other was to enhance EU integration. So what happened? That in the late 80s, NATO became the frontline organization for a lot of talks and treaties that led to a kind of ceiling being put on nuclear weapons and the possible nuclear confrontation which everyone feared between America-led Western alliance and the Soviet bloc led by Moscow. There were a whole lot of arms control treaty which saw eventually the decline of the Soviet Union because simultaneously their economy got exhausted. Russia began to emerge from the Soviet Union, and the famous arrangements between Gorbachev and President Reagan are pictures that we all still remember. But then in the 1980s, there was a decision taken, late 1980s, 89, 90, that NATO could get a new role outside Europe when we saw the collapse of the Soviet Union and also the end of the Berlin Wall that divided East and West Europe. NATO got involved in operations in ex-Yugoslavia, in Libya, and various other countries. More recently, we saw NATO elements joining America as part of a coalition of the willing, first in Iraq and then in Afghanistan. All along, the people at the receiving end were the Russians or the ex-Soviet Union who were being painted as the bad guys. On this all entire heap sat a man called Vladimir Putin. Now, President Putin was a lieutenant colonel in the KGB when the Berlin Wall began to collapse. He was at a KGB station called Dresden in Germany. And he swore that there would be a time that he will avenge this humiliation of Mother Russia. This is what led to Mr. Putin's desire to go into Crimea first in 2014 and now into Ukraine. All in all, under the pretext that I'm going to stop the expansion of NATO. He had reason to believe that was a possibility because from the last 10 years or more, NATO was suddenly expanding rapidly. It threw into the air the arrangements like the Budapest Memorandum and the various other arrangements that had been sought by Russia from the Western European countries, such as in Bucharest. And by 2007, it became very clear that NATO would keep expanding. So starting from a group of about a dozen countries, NATO first expanded in the 50s, then again in the 70s and 80s, and now NATO has 30 European countries other than Canada and America, and is looking to add 2 more now, Sweden and Finland. So what is going to be the Russian response to that? One, Russia has already threatened cutting off of oil, gas and electricity supplies to Finland and some other countries that are hammering away for NATO membership. Turkey, as a NATO member, interestingly, is not part of the white European alliance against Russia. But Turkey is a NATO member and it has played a strategic role during the Cuban Missile Crisis of the 1960s when NATO missile systems pointed at the former Soviet Union, now Russia, were stationed in Turkey. And without publicizing it too much, while the Soviets were discussed and browbeaten by the Americans to pull off their missiles from Cuba that was pointed to Florida and other parts of American mainland, NATO missiles are also withdrawn from Turkey. So Turkey has always been an important member of NATO. If you remember in Gulf War I, Turkey's air bases were crucial for NATO usage by fighter aircrafts as a rule don't have very long range. So they need air bases as close to the operational zone. And it was the bases in Turkey that allowed NATO countries to enforce the diktat of America on Iraq. Now we have a situation where Russia could possibly preempt the Finns and the Swedes, who have sworn neutrality in the past, and their desire to join NATO because they're not yet NATO members. And could Russia expand its conflict into these two countries? If it does, technically NATO cannot intervene because they're not yet NATO members. And what will this entail? This will entail greater stress on the European countries that what could follow next. Mr. Putin's options have begun to run out because his operations in Ukraine have gone quite awry and not quite to plan. So, in the current circumstances, would Russia use its military force levels to attack Finland? If that were to happen, this would create a bigger war in Europe, which is what intelligence agencies and America had been warning, though America has not really helped the cause of peace because of the huge supplies of arms it has pumped into Ukraine. Some would argue that the arms merchants in America and defense companies really want that conflict to go on because the longer it lasts, the more money they make in selling arms and weapons to Ukraine and European countries who are buying it and giving it in Ukraine. The other aspect is that NATO has, since the end of the Cold War, which one would likely put the date around 1991, 92, had begun to defang itself. That means military spending in NATO had been reduced dramatically, and in some countries it was well below 2% of GDP, which is an essential NATO requirement to be a member. So all these countries that are now NATO members are now being asked to enhance military spending. Germany is at the forefront of that. It has already dedicated 100 billion euros, which is about 135 billion US dollars, for rearming itself. And remember, Germany is a military giant of World War II fame. The second country that could get into this militarization would be a country like France, which has earlier in the past kept away from NATO's military dimension, because by 1966-67 it had pushed out NATO's military headquarters to outside of France in a place in Belgium called Mons. And finally, we have now a situation where these countries are preparing for a long-haul confrontation with Russia. With Russia now poised to make some dramatic changes to the conflict situation, since the conflict situation has plateaued out, there is a strong possibility that NATO and Russia could be in for a confrontation. If that happens, NATO has some shortcomings. It is right now a kind of rapid reaction force, not a regular mobilized military force of the kind that was in the Cold War. Secondly, NATO's leadership has been handed over the last 2 decades, largely to politicians and civilian appointees. Now there is a problem there. Civilians are not able to think in terms of military dimension to a conflict. So NATO needs to revamp itself. Finland and Sweden will have to wait till their membership is fully approved. Zelensky's Ukraine will continue to receive weapon systems, and Russia's fears that NATO is arming itself to attack Russia will further look real, and this could see an escalated response from Putin. Where does it leave India? India has to stand apart. It's a European conflict, has to wait and watch, and that is the big question. Could Quad, which India is now a member of, also go the NATO way with more political waffle and very little military precision, or would militarization become a strong element of Quad, which is an essential part of countering China's expansion?